Now, to shamelessly, quote from American constitutional history, we may find these truths to be self-evident. That there is an emerging nexus between the Trump administration and the settler movement. In the summer of 2006, last summer, then candidate Trump had opened a West Bank campaign office in the settlement of Karne Shomron to get out the American-Israeli vote for the Trump presidency. We still don't know the electoral results, but we could presume that this may have had an impact, at least in terms of the counting of absentee votes, when it came to the Trump presidency. And certainly many other members of his administration have deep ties to the Israeli settler movement and to specifically to the settlement of Beit El in the occupied territories. The new U.S. ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, was a political and philanthropic supporter of Beit El, and the Jared Kushner Family Foundation, of course, Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of the president, has also been had deep ties to the Israeli settler camp over the past several decades, and notably with these new characters as essentially parts of the new administration. This only develops these relations further, and have become an important part of what we think President Trump's policy towards the occupied territories may be, especially with the perhaps diplomatic slip last week of the presumed occupied territories by Ambassador David Friedman, as quoted in the press, that perhaps this portends some kind of shift in terms of the new president's policy in dealing with the settlements question as part of a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But what I want to suggest is that this relationship goes far beyond the Trump administration and a few of his chief advisors, but is really the story of of two populations that have evolved over the past 50 years since the 1967 war. Today, over 60,000 American Jews live in the occupied territories. That is something like 15% of the Israeli settler movement, and about half of American Israelis in Israel, Palestine, both within and beyond the Green Line. So certainly American Jews and American immigrants within the Israeli settler camp are overrepresented both within the settlement enterprise itself and more largely within the body of American immigrants to Israel, which is generally the largest group of diaspora Jews that have made Aliyah or have immigrated to Israel over the past 5 decades. So I want to take you back in time to the 1967 war where this all began, and also to take a little journey back across the ocean to the United States, because this is a story that really begins in the United States with a cohort of American Jews who were deeply affected by the dynamics of the 1967 war and other concurrent trends that are taking place in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And then we'll follow them on their journey to not only to Israel, but specifically to the occupied territories, and try and unravel some of these questions about why did these American Jews who are living a good life in America decide to settle at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We know that they are headline-grabbing constituency, and that they've made news for over 50 years, sometimes for shocking acts of terrorism, and others in generally that they have become the public relations spokespeople of the Israeli settler camp. So they're frequent figures that are we're reading in our newspapers or listening to on our radios or seeing on our television screens. But very little is known about who they are and why they chose to devote their lives to living at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I want to start with the 1967 war. And to underscore what a profound impact this had upon American Jewry as a whole, and more specifically for this cohort of American Jews that would later immigrate to Israel and then the occupied territories. It's without doubt, the 1967 war was a watershed moment for American Jewry. As Norman Podhoretz once said, the 1967 war turned American Jews into Zionists. If we go back in time a little bit before the 1967 war, and certainly before the 1948 war, American Jewry was really rather agnostic, and sometimes even quite ambivalent about the Zionist movement, and while had been financially and politically supportive of the birth of the State of Israel in 1948, and subsequent military campaigns where they had contributed heavily financially, Suffice to say, Israel was not really the center of the American Jewish agenda up until the 1967 war. If we looked at a commentary magazine symposium about the state of American Jewry in 1966, which ran to some 130-odd pages, the word Israel only appeared twice, and not necessarily in the most positive context. So we can see that really it was on the periphery of the American Jewish agenda, which was much more concerned with questions of assimilation, of anti-Semitism, of post-World War II, identity, in a time where Jewry outside of the United States had largely been decimated, and American Jews themselves were trying to grapple with the idea that outside of Israel, which at the time was still quite a sort of small and fledgling state, living a kind of a precarious existence in the 1950s, and American Jewry was really quickly becoming the center of Jewish life worldwide. And so up until the 1967 war, Israel did not play a major role in the minds of most American Jews, but this quickly turned in 6 days in June in 1967, when American Jewry was revolutionized and organized politically, emotionally, philanthropically, theologically, and most certainly intellectually around this dramatic victory by the State of Israel, the conquest of new territories, and the general perception that a second Holocaust had been forestalled. And for American Jewry of this generation, there was really nothing like it. Many of those I interviewed really spoke about how much they followed the events of the 1967 war. One woman who later settled in the heart of Hebron told me that she had spent every day of the 6-day war, meticulously clipping New York Times articles and posting them in her scrapbook to remember the moment. Others told me that that this had changed their entire course of their childhood and their future, and they said that the day the 1967 war broke out, they knew that they were going to move to Israel. Others really saw that this was an opportunity for them to redeem themselves or redeem their generation for what they perceived as the passivity of American Jews during the Holocaust. And those who had been the founders of the West Bank settlement of Tekoa told me that this was really, for them, they saw this as a potential second Holocaust, and that they had they now realized the precariousness of Israel's existence and what they were going to need to do personally to invest their time, their energy, and often their own resources in its future. Last but not least, many really reckoned with the idea that they might have great guilt if they didn't contribute to Israel's security in the future. One man who I spoke to, who later settled in the West Bank settlement of Karnei Shomron, said that he had, just graduated with a doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania in aeronautics. He was about to take a managerial position at General Electric, which was considered at the time to be a very excellent white-collar trajectory in life, and he said that, I wondered what my children would say to me if, 30 years from now, they would say, where were you when the state of Israel was going to be destroyed, and what did you do about it? And he knew that, this was going to put him on the path to a different future than that which he had imagined for himself in the United States, and later led him to move to Israel in 1969 and settle in the West Bank settlement of Karnei Shomron some years later. But certainly for American Jewry as a whole, the 1967 war brought about profound changes in their political attitudes. Something like 99% of American Jews supported Israel during the 1967 war, but more broadly in their emotional response to Israel and the location of Israel within the national Jewish agenda. It also prompted theological change that brought Israel to be a much more mainstream part of the liturgy and traditions of American Jewry in a way that it had not been included on a regular basis in either the prayers or the general communal discussion previously. And of course, it also prompted a much more rigorous intellectual engagement with the idea of the State of Israel and what its future might be. Now, the 1967 war, of course, didn't happen in isolation and also took place in the heady times of the 1960s and 1970s, and there were many other trends that were, that were taking place concurrently that affected American Jews' appreciation of the 1967 war when it came in what I call the 1967 moment. One important factor, as we mentioned before, was this sense that 1967 had forestalled the second Holocaust. This was a time of new Holocaust reckoning in America, where American Jewry in particular were speaking much more openly about the Holocaust than they had in the first, decade and a half or 2 decades after World War II, and this equating of the 1967 war and the Holocaust, or the Shoah, became a very important part of the understanding of why 1967 had such a profound impact on American Jews as a whole, and certainly this cohort that later moved to the occupied territories. A second important trend that was happening in the late 1960s and 1970s wasn't really about Jews, it was about the way Jews also began to see themselves. There was a new movement towards ethnic identification in the United States, and this idea of the emergence of the hyphenated identity, which we are also familiar with today. This was a time when, African Americans, Polish Americans, other white ethnics, alongside Jews, were really rediscovering the ethnic part of their identity and realizing that the assimilationist impulse in the United States, which had often encouraged new Americans to leave behind their ethnic trappings, could be considered differently, and that the great melting pot of America could also not be quite so melted in a way that American Jews, like many other groups, could place the emphasis on the Jewish part of their identity as much as the American part of their identity, and that these two ideas could live in harmony. They also were drawing from African American and Black power, understanding that Jewish is beautiful as much as Black is beautiful, or Polish is beautiful, and that this really became a moment of Jewish pride. And when Israel, and with Israel's great victories in the 1967 war, these two trends sort of reinforced each other, and that there's this great sense of euphoria in Israel, as well as American Jewish pride in what Israel's achievements had been, which only sort of reinforced a new kind of ethnic identification. Last but not least, the 1967 war, of course, took place against the backdrop of great change in the United States, and the heyday of American social movements in the 1960s and 1970s, the civil rights struggle and the anti-Vietnam War movement, of which American Jews were heavily engaged in and sympathetic to. However, in the summer of 1967, the New Left, and especially the Black Power component of the New Left, really turned quickly against Israel and its activities in the 1967 war. In the late summer of 1967, the SNCC issued a proclamation denouncing the state of Israel and moving very quickly towards a policy of Palestinian solidarity. And for many radical American Jews who wanted to understand how they could be both radical and Jewish at the same time, this was a major moment of reflection, and often of angst, because they quickly came to realize that these progressive spaces where they had been quite active prior to 1967 were no longer as friendly to them. Today we might often see that Zionism has become some kind of incompatible with other forms of identity politics, that you can't be a Zionist in Black Lives Matter, that it's hard to be a Zionist in the feminist movement, that generally it's hard to be a Zionist in the progressive camp today. But this really started in the summer of 1967 and led many American Jews to really question their place in the secular social movements of their day. So for some, this manifested as a turn away from their Zionism, certainly that they were more interested in participating generally within secular causes and remaining within the civil rights camp or the anti-Vietnam camp. But for many, it led them away from the movements which they had been active in prior to the 1967 war, and more deeply into a kind of particularist activism around Jewish causes, whether that be the new the student struggle for Soviet Jewry, or even Meir Kahana's Jewish Defense League, which they saw as a way to express their radicalism as Jews, but devote themselves to Jewish causes. When I spoke to Eli Birnbaum, who was one of the founders of the West Bank settlement of Tekoa, he said, prior to the 1967 war, I'd been out on the streets demonstrating for everybody, for the African Americans, for the Eskimos, you name it, but why wouldn't I demonstrate for anything Jewish? And he, first sort of tried to explore this route of activism in the United States, but later decided that he was going to quite literally manifest his destiny in the occupied territories. Now, what I'm trying to get to here is that these 60,000 American Jews, many of which came in the years between 1967 and 1977, were very much part and parcel of their generation. They were young, they were upwardly mobile, they were traditional but not necessarily strictly orthodox in their religious practice, and highly engaged in and sympathetic to the social movements of their day and voting for the Democratic Party. These weren't neoliberals, these were not neoconservatives, these were not right-wing activists. These were people who were very much part and parcel of their generation. And this is important because when they moved over the Green Line in the years after the 1967 war, they didn't leave this heritage behind. And in fact, what they saw themselves doing was continuing in their activism for, human and civil rights, but this time for human and civil rights for Jews. And that they saw that their project in the occupied territories was really a way of expressing this rights discourse that they had grown up with and had been sort of loyal followers of in the United States, and also wished to put in service of their causes as Jewish Israelis and as American Jewish Israelis in the occupied territories. So in the years after the 1967 war, thousands and thousands of American Jews came to Israel, and many began to settle in the new settlements in the occupied territories. We have to remember that between 1967 and 1973, there was very limited settlement over the Green Line. This consisted only of the reestablishment of the kibbutzim in the Gush Etzion, or Tree of Zion region of the West Bank outside of Jerusalem, which had existed prior to the 1948 war, as well as the reestablishment of a Jewish presence in the city center of Hebron, which had existed up until the Hebron riots in 1929. Americans were engaged in both of these projects. Sandy Anichai, a woman from Los Angeles, California, who had been a member of the B'nai Akiva youth group in the United States, who joined the new group at Kibbutz Kfar Etzion, and Miriam Levinger, the wife of Moshe Levinger, one of the later founders of Gush Amunim, the Block of the Faithful, who hailed from the Bronx, and famously brought her refrigerator and 8 children in tow to resettle Hebron in the spring of 1968. But up until the 1973 war, there really wasn't very much settlement, so correspondingly there wasn't very much for Americans to take part in. But one of the interesting things that I found in the archives was that the Americans were still dreaming about what they might have the opportunity to build, and I found a really fascinating plan, which you'll enjoy reading about in my book because it's really quite comical, about a man from Baltimore, a real estate developer and rabbi from Baltimore, Maryland, who had an idea for what he called Shalom City Israel in the occupied territories. It would be kind of a new, what I would like to call a city on a hilltop, riffing on the city on the hill, to American Jewry and the world at large. It had some pretty wild ideas about what an American settlement in the West Bank might look like. And in fact, what I later found was some of these, these visions of pioneering, of building utopian communities, and the American style bourgeois settlement really came to pass after the 1973 war, and the establishment of 3 settlements that I looked at in particular that had been founded by and for Jewish American immigrants in the occupied territories, at Yamit in the Sinai Peninsula, Efrat, and Tekoa in the West Bank. Yamit, of course, is an interesting case. It was founded by a Gar'in of Americans primarily from Cincinnati, Ohio, a cantor and his wife, along with many others who joined from other parts of the United States, who came to settle at Yamit in the Sinai, which had been a city backed by Moshe Dayan in the aftermath of the 1973 war to establish primarily a military presence in the Sinai, and Yamit was probably going to become a nuclear weapons depot, although that would not entirely know, but certainly was going to be a major military base in the Sinai. And Americans who'd gotten word about this project, decided it sounded like a great place for them to, live on the seaside and have a, wonderful coastal existence. Now, the Israeli government had different ideas, and this led to a huge amount of friction. And as part of this larger story that I tried to tell in the book of, the moving parts that existed in American participation in the Israeli settler camp, which, is kind of a story of, alliances and unlikely bedfellows between the American groups, the Israeli government, the native Israeli settler movement, and the Palestinians, and sometimes sort of unpredictable unpredictable alliances had formed. And certainly in Yamit, Americans came up against the hostility often of the Israeli government that didn't really see how they would fit into the strategic plan for settling the Sinai. But Americans there prevailed, and they managed to establish homes and industry in Yamit up until 1978, with the beginning of the Israeli-Egyptian peace process, where it later became clear that Israel was going to have a full military and civilian disengagement from the Sinai, which would mean the removal of these American settlers and their comrades at Yamit. And Americans really struggled to internalize this new reality, and much of this chapter is really about the sort of sad saga of this group who came with a great deal of idealism, but left with a real pragmatism about the meaning of peace for the future. Their story has been very different from that of the settlement of Efrat, which is probably the largest American-Israeli settlement in the occupied territories and probably the best known to this audience, which has always billed itself as within the Israeli consensus of a future final status agreement. Of course, as I had mentioned earlier, there had been pre-existing settlement in the Gush Etzion region of the West Bank prior to the 1948 war, and Efrat is very much traded on this status to secure itself both strategically and within sort of the national discourse around the future of settlements. Efrat was founded by Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, also known as Stevie Wonder, Rabbi Stephen Riskin, from the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and his congregation and other followers who came primarily from the New York and New Jersey region of America to settle in the West Bank in the early 1980s, alongside another group from South Africa. I didn't really go into the details of the South African case, but it's a very interesting story that I hope some other researchers will pick up on. What's interesting about Efrat, in addition to the fact that it is sort of known as the Teaneck, New Jersey of the West Bank, is that, or as Rabbi Riskin himself has joked that Efrat really should be known as occupied Scarsdale, is that it had it was a product originally of a partnership between a native Israeli settler activist, Moshe Moshkowitz, who had been a child of the pre-1948 Gush Etzion kibbutzim, and this dynamic American spiritual leader who is known for real progressive religious innovation, but it turns out is perhaps not quite such a progressive when it comes to his own political doctrine. And the story is really about the radicalization of what was known as a kind of moderate bourgeois settlement, especially during the 1990s. And we now know that in the course of these protests that took place at Efrat, Yigal Amir, who later went on to assassinate Yitzhak Rabin, who had been active in this movement. So we might ask ourselves, how is it that a future assassin of a prime minister of the state of Israel comes from this bourgeois, came from taking part in activism in this bourgeois settlement in the West Bank? So I think the story of Efrat is one of where lifestyle politics meet political realities, and that this idea that Efrat, which has become known as really the high street of the West Bank, the kind of place where you can have $1 million mansion alongside your messianic impulse to live in the whole of the land of Israel, is perhaps not really such a moderate place after all. This contrasts a bit with the settlement of Tekoa, which was the last settlement that I profiled in the book, which was founded deliberately in the midst of the Camp David Accords to prevent the success of a Palestinian autonomy track, and more largely any further disengagement from the West Bank in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Today, Tekoa is something of a victim of its own success. It's grown so dramatically that perhaps the idea that it would ever be evacuated might be taken off the table, not to mention that Avigdor Lieberman, Israel's defense minister, lives right across the street in the settlement of Nokdim. But it's an interesting story of what happens when a settlement grows too fast, and how a vision that Americans came with perhaps doesn't coincide not only with the political realities, because Tekoa has experienced a very violent experience with its Palestinian neighbors in the West Bank, but more broadly how it might fit into a larger peace accord in the future. The last part of the book really looks at the period from the 1990s onwards, and I see that the participation of American Jews within the Israeli settler camp has gone mostly in two directions during the course of the Oslo Accords and beyond. The first would be the paths of settler terrorism. I think if I asked anybody in this room if you could name one American Israeli settler in the occupied territories, perhaps the first name that might come to mind would be Baruch Goldstein, the perpetrator of the 1994 murders at the Tomb of the Patriarch, where he gunned down 29 worshippers in the midst of morning prayers in the Ibrahimi Mosque, and wounded over 100 others. Baruch Goldstein, Baruch Goldstein's story and his radicalization deserves attention, which is chronicled in the book, but he is not alone amongst several other high-profile Americans that have been active in, vigilante terrorism against their Palestinian neighbors, including most recently, probably in the murder of the Dawabsha family in Duma. Amongst many other cases, including activism in the Jewish underground, Meir Kahana's Terror Keneged Terror movement, and other prominent names which are chronicled in the book. But while American Israelis have undoubtedly been active in settler terrorism, and there's no attempt to deny this, for the most part, American Israeli settlers have also been law-abiding citizens of the state of Israel who have gone on their government's, with their government's permission to settle in the occupied territories. But what I think is important to note is that they have all had to live being tarred with the same brush of the Baruch Goldsteins of the settler movement, and how they've responded to this, I think, goes in a very interesting direction, in the sense that many have turned towards public relations and kind of doubling down on their idea that they are to promote a kind of liberal cause for or a liberal struggle for human and civil rights for Jews in the occupied territories, and have used this in revolutionizing the public relations of the settler camp as savvy cosmopolitans and English language spokespeople that know how to communicate to Western audiences in the terms that we understand, which often involve, a discussion or discourse of rights. So I think this is a very important innovation of Israeli settlers, American Israeli settlers, and perhaps more than their activities as leaders and cadres within the movement, bringing both, bodies and capital to the settler project. I think that if we look 50 years from now, we may find indeed that this has been their most significant contribution to the movement as a whole. Last but not least, just to raise two, larger directions for the future. The first is to say that American Israelis, while a very interesting population within the Israeli settler camp, are not alone, and that the face of the Israeli settler movement today, if we may see them on television or more than other groups in the Israeli settler movement, has changed quite a bit from what we've been accustomed to seeing in our news broadcasts. That the native Israeli settler on a windswept hilltop of the West Bank, carrying an automatic rifle, who's a member of the national religious movement, who believes in an apocalyptic vision to settle the whole of the land of Israel, is really quite outdated. And this is, the face of the settler movement, which looked very much like this in the 1970s, has changed dramatically. And American Israelis are just part of this larger and much more complex mosaic of the Israeli settler camp in 2017, which has evolved dramatically. Today, a quarter of settlers are ultra-Orthodox. Another third probably are economic settlers who have whose lifestyle politics is not entirely benign. Certainly, it comes with certain political ramifications. But the idea that the Gush Emunim, the Bloc of the Faithful, and national religious cohort that we speak about so often is really the majority of the demographics of the settler camp is not accurate, and we have to look much more broadly at what the Israeli settler movement looks like in 2017. Last but not least, I also want to put forward the idea that American Israeli settlers are doing something very unique to other Americans, and more largely within the story of that I began with, of the story of American foreign policy. I think is also important to underscore that since the Second World War, and certainly since the Vietnam War, American foreign policy has talked the talk of human rights at home and not always walked the walk of the promotion of human rights abroad. And I think that American Israelis very much fall within this general thrust of American foreign policy over the last 5 decades, and to really consider them amongst American foreign policy actors. I think we need to move away from this model of the tinker-tailor soldier-spy of American foreign policy and think a bit more creatively about who Americans abroad are today, and how does America exercise its soft power apart from traditional structures and the class of public servants. And I think American Israeli settlers are as much a part of Israeli history as they are part of American history and of American foreign policy. So I think with that.